This was meant to be a stream about something else, but it was caused by a no-show problem. But I do have something to say to you, and it is about the national interest. I've just viewed a video by Alexander Mercouris talking about the Quad, the alliance system being set up by America, including India, Australia, Japan, and Britain, I think, to get over its foreign policy failure of having to withdraw from Afghanistan with its tail between its legs. I'll admit that I haven't been following it that closely, but it was talking about, Alexander Mercouris was talking about what the Australians are likely to do, and it's likely to just be loyal to its identity as a US vassal state, in the same way that Britain is expected to be loyal to its identity as a US vassal state. And I wondered to myself how healthy or constructive this is. As a political philosopher promoting the political ideology of nationalism, which I define as government in the national interest, this is the perfect problem for me to consider. And therefore I have to put myself in the place of Australians. And I think we should be able to free ourselves from these identitarian problems. While I know they are important in giving ourselves the identity that we need to know who we are in order to act appropriately, shall we say. But then there's so many, all these badges of identity, such as our age, our marital status, our sex, our sexual orientation. Did I say marital status? Religion, race, nationality, all these together give us a combination of characteristics that may or may not correctly predict our behaviour. So for Australia, I'm sure it still considers itself to be white and Protestant and English speaking and basically British. But then for Australia, Australia is, it's not Australia is not merely a concept. It is located in time and space and in a particular part of the world. And therefore it has a geopolitical identity. So where we live, where we reside, where we are based, and for how long has a determining factor on how we are likely to behave. So if we've all heard of the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. We have to fit in, whether we like it or not, to our surroundings, our neighbours, to the surrounding culture, or we will stick out like a sore thumb and be resented by our neighbours, such as Israel, which is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Now, I'm sure Israel would get along far better with its neighbours were it not a liberal democracy. It would get along like a house on fire with its Muslim neighbours if it became Muslim, for example, but for historic reasons is not going to do so. But for Israel, you think, Israel, the The Abrahamic God is also the God of Israel, and the God of Israel kickstarted the whole idea of the West's Judeo-Christian identity, and that is currently in competition. Is it? But anyway, the West's Judeo-Christian identity is, I think it would be fair to say, in a clash of civilization kind of way, it's in competition with Islam. That's why people talk about the clash of civilizations. But then, how much of Western identity now in the 21st century is about its Judeo-Christian identity? Very little, I suspect. Most Westerners are in fact atheists and have no idea of biblical stories or Christian beliefs or anything of the sort. They are in fact completely alienated from their Judeo-Christian traditions. And I do particularly remember this because when I was studying history, which was quite a while ago, I remember my history teacher saying what a terrible thing it would be if Westerners lose their Judeo-Christian identity. And I wondered at the time what it really was. And I thought, well, it must mean being Christian. But it was a bit more than that. It is really about knowing the same stories of your national mythology, I think. Yes, that's what I really mean. So we have the greatest story ever told, the Ten Commandments, all these sort of Hollywood blockbusters. I know this is really harking back to an ancient time, but Charlton Heston and all the Hollywood greats, they made these movies, and once upon a time, most people would have watched them the world over, and this would become part of their Western identity. Whether they actually believed in God or not was unimportant. They would know the story of the Ten Commandments. And now that has been lost. And these are, of course, stories that connect those who know the story with each other. So if I were to talk about a movie that you have loved and enjoyed in the same way, because I loved and enjoyed it too, we would have a connection with each other. We would know the same cultural references, the same characters, the same plot, and we would have this kind of connection to each other. And fairy tales would be this connection for children. Disney films would be this sort of thing. I suppose these days it would be the superheroes of Marvel Comics or DC Comics. But these are more recent creations, and the fact that something is ancient sanctifies it. And obviously, Bible stories are even more sacred because they are even older than Grimm's fairy tales, or those of Hans Christian Andersen, or even the Greek myths. So it is through stories that we connect with each other. And so part of the stories that is part of our collective memory would be the founding myths of our nation, whoever or whatever we are. Now, Australia is of course a British creation, but then so was America, America declared independence after the War of American Independence. But Australia is technically still British. And this you know by when you come across these anachronistic titles such as Governor General and that sort of thing. But that was how it was in the olden days. You had a colony, you would send a governor to govern it in the same way that Pontius Pilate governed Israel when he was governor. And so he would have the power of life and death over its subjects, which happened to be Jesus at the time. I mean, the only reason why Jesus was dragged before Pontius Pilate was because the Jews in Israel, having been taken over by the Romans, no longer had the power to exact the death penalty on its own members, and they wanted Jesus dead, and that therefore Jesus had to be hauled before Pontius Pilate and be sentenced to death. And he obviously couldn't see the point of it because, as far as Romans were concerned, blasphemy wasn't a thing, and he didn't particularly want to dirty with his hands with the death of somebody for a reason he couldn't quite understand. Now, Australia is still technically British, and this is what we must understand. To understand Australian national identity, and similarly Canadian national identity. Of course, they're all US vassal states in the same way that Britain is a US vassal state. So, oh good, I think I'm still live. I wasn't sure if I was. So, where was I? Chrissy Ramsey talks about. I wasn't even talking about secular Quranism, but thank you for talking about it. So, as far as the Australian national interest is concerned, what is Australian national identity? Its history was created by, well, convicts being transported from London, mostly. The Australian accent is very similar to the, well, Cockney accent. And so, basically, Australia was peopled by the working classes of London who were charged on a chopped up charge for stealing bread or whatever, but the whole purpose of it was to get a whole lot of white people to be transported to the other side of the world to people the British colony of Australia. And that was really the whole purpose of it. So it was a penal colony that eventually became a country. And therefore, its entire history has to be examined in this light. So we know that Britain declared war on Germany in the First and Second World War. We know that the lives of Australians were lost in it because Britain basically treated the lives of Australian men as part of its, as a resource to fight its imperial wars. And this tradition continues with Britain basically passing on Australia to America. So we don't know if Australians themselves are aware of this or not particularly. Those of you who watch The Crown will remember a particular episode in which Charles and Diana went to visit Australia, and this was one of their trips that they would have to do. And the Prime Minister was Bob Hawke, who was hoping to somehow humiliate the British by showing, what a out of touch or chinless wonder Charles was. And he would have done so had it not been for Diana, whom the Australians adored because of her winning ways. So because of Diana, the Republicans of Australia didn't manage to get their independence in their referendum. But that has come and gone. I'm sure if there was such a thing again happening now, particularly with regard to whether to, with all these treaties that are popping up that Australia is expected to sign up to with this nuclear submarine deal, obviously it would help Australians decide if they knew who the hell they are. And also we know that under Gough Whitlam, some deal was done whereby the CIA were involved. So basically, he was sacked when he was, I can't remember now, what was it? It was something about some spy base or something, and he didn't want it on Australian territory, and the Governor General basically sacked him, and that was the end of him. And although Australians might not actually be aware of this incident or don't particularly remember it, it was obviously to do with their national sovereignty and the fact that they themselves did not have control over what they wanted in their own territory, and they'd be co-opted by the CIA. And the British had basically, sold them to America, or given them to America. So for the Australian, how is he to think? Obviously, being where they are in the Pacific, it would mean that the greatest regional power would be China, who want to buy stuff from them, and they could have a mutually profitable trading relationship if the Australians weren't so stuck up about what about their national and racial and cultural identity. So this is something for Australians to consider. What is more important? And I think, apart from one's cultural, religious, linguistic identity, the fact that where we happen to be is also a big decider for for of how we are to behave and what we are to do. And I don't think Australians have thought that much about it because there are quite a few unresolved issues about whether that they would prefer to sever connections between Australia and Britain. But it's not even with Britain now. Things have moved on so far. Britain has basically sold Australia to America. And I guess they will need to deal with the Americans if they wanted to have some any idea of what they wanted to do as Australians rather than just following the orders of America. And I suppose the whole point of having a national interest to consider is to actually decide whether you, as a nation, actually enjoy national sovereignty. And if you don't, then I guess you don't have a national interest to consider. You're just a vassal state, and you are obliged to do as your overlord directs you to do. And this means Australians have to decide whether to submit or challenge their identity of being a US vassal state. And you're so wrong about me, Christine Ramsey. I wasn't going to talk about secular Quranism at all, but I really like it when people talk about secular Quranism before I do. In fact, secular Quranism was not really on my mind. Yes, I know I put the thumbnail there, but that was only because I wanted to talk about Australia. And secular Quranism would make it more likely for you to have national sovereignty because secular Quranism would restore your patriarchy, and when you live under patriarchy, you are more likely to decide things in an honest and rational way, as well as in a principled way. But while you're a matriarchy, you will not be capable of talking about anything honestly or rationally or in a principled way. So that's why I do advocate patriarchy, because only under a patriarchy would you produce enough good, strong men to defend the national interest. And obviously, for all of us, our sense of our self-esteem will be tied up with what kind of country we live in, whether we think we are a civilized society or whether we think we are a failed state. And obviously, if we live in a failed state, we would have self-esteem issues, as you would expect people who live in a failed state to suffer. So all these decisions are moral and political, and they will be based on whatever moral system that we decide to follow, and that will have implications for our self-esteem and our future. And that's all I want to say. Thank you very much. An irritating comment by Christine Ramsey, who has never been to China, nor will she ever go because she is that sort of person. Quite often, people like her are more informed about their own prejudices and by any neutral, objective observation of whatever they are observing, such as China. So I guess you'd have to go there to decide whether China is a failed state or not. But being a woman without principles, she wants to think of China as a failed state, and therefore that's what she wants. She will bend reality to reflect her preference, which is exactly the kind of thing you're not supposed to do if you want to survive. You have to acknowledge reality as it is and plan your life accordingly, not wish for something to happen and then behave as if the reality that you dislike doesn't exist. Unfortunately, many people have for several generations been brought up to ignore truth, to reject logic, to have no principles. And that is a consequence of bad parenting, really, because what you're supposed to teach your children is, well, you have to teach them reason so they can work things out for themselves. And, if you have anything useful to teach them, then that's what you should do. But, if you leave it all to your failing state school, then it's very possible that your children will be a disappointment, who can't reason, who tell lies, who have no principles and get themselves into trouble. Self-hating Jew seems to think that China is run on communism. Yes, it is a bit confusing, isn't it? I mean, talking about Australia, the Liberal Party is really the Conservative Party. I mean, and that's when you know how hopeless a situation is, when conservatism and liberalism are used interchangeably in different parts of the world, in the English-speaking world. So obviously it's going to cause confusion, and maybe it's meant to cause confusion, but we need to basically have a rule book that we can all agree on. Well, we don't have to agree with all the rules, because the whole idea of the law being above us is that, the law is the law whether we like it or not. But what is necessary is that we all know what the law is, or what rule book we are following, and what rules are contained in that rule book. That is basically the whole basis of a moral system, that we can agree on what they are, what it is, as well as what the rules are, and we plan our lives according to our understanding of this moral system. But unfortunately for the West, it has no moral system. One of the things that Alexander Mercouris was talking about was the difference between international law and something about some rule-based system. It was just another sort of newfangled term which suggested America wanted to change the rules. Let me see if I can find it for you. Yeah, the It's called this rules-based international order. So what's the difference between that and international law? So I think this newfangled term, it's in a way rather sinister. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is a bit complicated, and actually I haven't worked it out before. But I think any changing of the wording or the names of particular systems, rule systems, is sinister and to be studied, and not going to explain this complicated stuff to you because I don't know it myself. But anyway, when you change the meaning of words, you are changing a lot of things because all words represent an idea, and ideas are, well, they can be big and they can be small, and obviously a lot of them have significant consequences on how we relate to each other, particularly if it's a law, and particularly if it's the words are important words like marriage and who can get married, and this will change the way we relate to each other. Because if you can have gay marriage, then it means that the most important human relationship has changed. And of course, all advanced societies have understood the significance of marriage, because if you want to stay in existence as a nation, then you would have to produce the next generation, and long ago people recognized that the best way of producing the next generation is for men and women to marry each other and commit to each other in order to produce the next generation. And unfortunately, in the West, for the last 50 years or so, this idea has been loosened, and now we are in the unfortunate position of having most parents in our society, in Western nations, not being married to each other, and this means that most children have been brought up in fatherless homes, and this means that they will have mental health issues and not do as well in schools as they should, and standards will be lowered, and the teaching profession geared towards hiding the failure of the education system, and making these children not fit to be hired by local businesses who will prefer immigrant labour, and the sort of web of lies that is required to keep the system going, lying to the people who don't know any better, and all because Western governments want to say that democracy is the best system in the world. But I think increasingly people are becoming aware that democracy is in fact a fraud, and they're saying, well, we'd rather be more strictly ruled strictly governed, as long as we know who, the person in charge. And you can understand the desire for this trade-off. People will eventually get get tired of being told pretty lies and say, we will be able to manage our lives better if we know what the rules really are, and we will only know what the real rules really are if the person who's supposed to be in charge is really in charge. And we are getting to that situation, and I hope I will assist that process by saying, if you want a rule-based system, you'll have to find a system of rules that is supposedly divine, because liberalism doesn't have a rule book. Liberalism is a cushion that bears the imprint of the last pair of buttocks that sat on it. So whoever is leader of any Western nation who's changed some significant who has passed a significant law such as legalizing gay marriage, as David Cameron has done, will be saying it's a conservative achievement to legalize gay marriage. And of course, conservatism was not meant to legalize gay marriage, because conservatism is really a branch of liberalism, a minor branch of liberalism. When you think of the purpose of conservatism, it was created to protect traditional values from being eroded by the ideas of the French Revolution, the very radical ideas of the French Revolution. And so conservatism was created in England and France eventually, because they were the ones who had the revolution, and after they got tired of being revolting peasants, they had to do things sensibly again, and they tried to reimpose some sense of order, and they used the idea of conservatism because they could no longer use the Catholic Church, having beheaded quite a few Catholic priests during the Revolution. So European history has been really a process of moving away from Christianity in the last 200 years or so. And obviously, these steps away from European traditionalism, which was monarchy and Christianity, would be represented by the American Revolution and the French Revolutions, and whose ideas that we are still living under. Now, are these ideas sustainable? I'm saying no, they're not, because liberalism has no handbook and neither has conservatism. And this means that these ideas, these words are mere words whose ideology has no official handbook to formally state its principles. And so this means that the law will continue to be changed by incompetent and corrupt politicians until Western nations become failed states. And this is why secular Quranism is so important in preventing this terrible event from happening. So there you are. I have managed to incorporate secular Quranism into my little talk about the Australian national interest. And of course, the best way of managing this thing is to get all nations in the world to adopt secular Quranism and let them interpret it in their own little way. So China would have its own interpretation, and so would Israel and India and all these countries. Well, it's important that they feel they have control, and when they do, it would, the world would roughly be all right about the most important laws that different nations would need to conduct relations with each other. So I hope I have managed to reinforce your understanding of secular Quranism at a national and international level. And now I really will have to go now. Thank you all for listening so carefully and respectfully.